The dog tag was still warm. That detail matters. Remember it. Sergeant First Class Raymond Kowalski, 34th Armored Regiment, 4th Armored Division, picked it up from the mud outside Aricourt, France on the morning of September 19, 1944. And the metal was warm because the man who'd worn it had been dead for less than 4 minutes. Private First Class Dennis Ochoa, 19 years old, from Laredo, Texas, had been the first American soldier to die in what German commanders had already decided would be a minor action. A brief, efficient repulse of what they privately called die amateur. The amateurs. They were so certain of victory that one panzer commander had his orderly prepare a formal dinner to be served in Aricourt's town hall that evening. The dinner was never served. What happened in the rolling farmland southeast of Nancy, France, between September 18th and September 29th, 1944, would later be called the largest tank battle on the Western Front since D-Day. The Germans committed over 400 armored vehicles and some of the most battle-hardened panzer crews in the Wehrmacht. The Americans who stopped them, who didn't just stop them but destroyed them, were green tankers, many of whom had never fired a shot in combat before that week. So here is the question that should keep you watching. How does a unit of inexperienced American tankers, cut off, outgunned, and outnumbered inside a French village they've held for less than 72 hours, defeat the most feared armored force in the German army? The answer isn't firepower, it isn't luck, it's a trick. And the Germans never saw it coming, and because they never believed Americans were smart enough to use it. By the first week of September 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army had done something military historians still struggle to fully explain. In a single month, his forces had torn across 400 miles of French countryside, liberating town after town, consuming fuel at a rate that defied every logistical model the army had built. Patton's men moved so fast that they outran their own supply lines. By September 10th, the Third Army had effectively been halted, not by German resistance, but by empty fuel tanks. This was the strategic trap that the Germans believed would save them. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, understood the opportunity immediately. Patton's advance had created an enormous, ill-exposed salient, a bulge of American-held territory jutting eastward, with flanks that were thin, stretched, and vulnerable. The industrial city of Nancy had just fallen to the Americans on September 15th. But the ground to the east, a plateau of open farmland near the village of Aricourt, was not yet secured. It sat at the junction of roads that connected to Lunéville, Sarrebourg, and the Moselle River. Roads that any further American advance into Germany would depend upon absolutely. If the Germans could take Aricourt, they could cut the main axis of Patton's advance. If they could hold it, they could buy time for the Siegfried Line to be reinforced. And they had the tool to do it. The 5th Panzer Army, just reconstituted, equipped with new Panther tanks fresh from German factories, and commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of the most gifted armored commanders in the Wehrmacht. Von Manteuffel looked at his intelligence reports and allowed himself a rare moment of confidence. The unit holding the ground around Aricourt was Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division. They had 66 operational M4 Sherman tanks. His Panthers outgunned the Shermans at almost every relevant range. His crews were veterans, and the Americans, as his intelligence officers repeatedly assured him, had no real combat experience with massed armor. On September 17, 1944, von Manteuffel recorded in his personal diary, "The Americans have blundered into a position they cannot hold. They are courageous enough, but courage without experience is simply a faster way to die." He was wrong on every count that mattered, but he would not understand that for 11 days. The man who would prove him wrong was Captain Leroy Anderson, 37 years old, from Duluth, Minnesota, commanding officer of C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. Anderson was not a man who fit Hollywood's idea of a tank commander. He was thick-necked and slow-spoken, the kind of officer who listened more than he talked, who studied terrain maps so long his sergeants joked that he was trying to memorize France. He'd been a civil engineer before the war, and he thought about ground the way engineers think about it. Structurally, in terms of load, flow, and failure points. He had a photograph tucked inside his helmet liner. His daughter, Carol Ann, age 4, standing in front of their Duluth house in a winter coat 2 sizes too big. And he'd been overseas 17 months and hadn't seen her in 14 of them. Around him he had men he trusted. Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, his senior NCO, a former steel worker from Pittsburgh, 31 years old, a man of almost supernatural mechanical intuition who could diagnose an engine problem by sound the way a doctor diagnoses illness. Corporal James Tran, 22, from San Jose, California, the best gunner in the company, capable of acquiring a target at 900 meters from a moving tank, a skill so rare it had been documented in his performance review. And Private First Class Dennis Ochoa, the youngest, the one who'd only just stopped being nervous enough to talk during patrols. On September 17th, Anderson received his orders from Colonel Creighton Abrams. Yes, that Abrams, the man Patton personally called the champion of all tank soldiers, the future Army Chief of Staff, whose name would one day be given to the tank that replaced the Sherman entirely. The orders were direct: hold the high ground southeast of Aracourt. Intelligence reports indicated the nearest German armored concentration was at least 40 kilometers to the northeast, near Lunéville. The sector was described as, quote, lightly screened by reconnaissance elements. Anderson was to advance, establish observation posts, and secure the road junction by September 19th. Anderson studied the map, then he studied it again. He called Kowalski over. "What do you see?" he asked. Kowalski ran a finger along a valley running southwest of the village. "Dead ground," he said, "and you could hide a regiment in there and nobody looking at a map would know." Anderson looked at the valley, looked at the intelligence report, looked at the valley again. "Take extra ammunition," he told his company that evening. "All of it. Everything you can carry." No one told him why. But he knew. And what he knew. The flaw in the plan that headquarters hadn't caught, the valley full of dead ground that no aerial photograph had covered in the past 72 hours, was about to matter more than anything else in the battle. In his command bunker near Lunéville, General von Manteuffel briefed his panzer commanders on the evening of September 17th. The 113th Panzer Brigade, under Colonel Franz Becke, would lead the advance. The attack would begin at dawn on September 19th in fog. The Americans would not expect armor in such visibility. They would be overrun before they understood what was happening. One of Becke's subordinates, Major Werner Heilig, asked whether they should call for additional infantry support. Becke shook his head. "Against Shermans, against these Americans, we are bringing Panthers. It will be enough." He was already wrong. He didn't know it yet. Read those numbers one more time. 66 Shermans, 400 German armored vehicles, and headquarters telling Anderson the enemy was 40 kilometers away. What does a man do with information he knows is wrong? When the people who gave him the orders don't know what he knows? That question is what the next 24 hours are built on. Dawn on September 19th, 1944, arrived wrapped in dense fog, and the kind of fog that doesn't just limit visibility, it changes sound. It makes the rumble of tank engines seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It makes distances meaningless. It turns the familiar French countryside, the vine-strewn hillsides and muddy farm tracks southeast of Aracourt, into a gray, featureless plain where the next few meters are all that exist. Anderson's C Company moved out at 05:45 hours. Their objective was the road junction 1 kilometer east of the village, a crossing point where the roads to Moyenvik and Chateau Salin diverged. Intelligence said it was unoccupied. Anderson's lead tank, commanded by Kowalski, was 150 meters down the road toward the junction when Kowalski's radio crackled. "Tracks," Kowalski said. "Simply that." Anderson stopped the column. I got out of his tank, in enemy territory and fog, and walked forward to look himself. The road was churned, not by Allied vehicles. The tread marks were wider, deeper, more closely spaced than anything the 4th Armored was running. Panther tracks, recent. Anderson pressed his hand into one of the impressions. The mud in the tread mark was still moist at the bottom. These tracks were less than 2 hours old. He was already back in his turret, already transmitting when the fog erupted. The German attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. From the northeast, where intelligence said the enemy was. From the east, along the road they'd been ordered to use. And from the south. From the dead ground valley that Kowalski had pointed at on the map 2 nights ago, where 17 Panthers had spent the night hidden in a creek bed, the engines cold, waiting. The first round hit Anderson's lead tank, not his, Kowalski's, at 06:11 hours. The shell struck the left track and the tank slewed sideways into the ditch, still functional, crew alive but immobilized and blocking the road. The second round hit an ammunition carrier 40 meters back. It went up in a column of orange fire that Anderson would later describe in his after-action report as visible for what must have been 5 miles. Private First Class Dennis Ochoa was in a support vehicle behind the ammunition carrier. He was gone before the echo of the explosion reached the village. Anderson didn't stop. This is the part that matters. He didn't stop for Ochoa. He didn't stop for Kowalski's immobilized tank. He'd been trained, had trained himself, really, and by reading everything Patton's headquarters had distributed about armored warfare. To know that stopping in contact is dying slowly instead of dying quickly. He ordered the column to push forward and left off the road into the open farmland. The Germans had not expected that. Their kill zone was set up for a column on a road. But he was already off the road. The next 12 minutes were chaos at a level that defies orderly description. C Company lost 4 tanks in the initial contact. Sergeant First Class Kowalski, his track blown, directed fire from a stationary position with a radio and his own tank's gun until the transmission failed. Corporal Tran, in the 3rd tank, acquired and destroyed 2 Panthers at ranges between 400 and 600 meters. Achievable with the Sherman's 76mm gun if you knew the kill zones. Ida and Tran knew them. 3 other crew members were wounded. 1 Private Harold Biggs from Columbus, Ohio, continued to load the main gun with his left hand, while his right arm was wrapped in field dressing that had already soaked through red. Then the radio crackled. Colonel Abrams, not from close, from rear headquarters. "Anderson, new orders. Pull back to the village. Do not advance to the junction. Repeat, do not advance." Anderson looked at his situation. He was 300 meters from the junction. The Germans were between him and the village, not in front of him. To retreat meant driving back through the concentrated German line that had just closed behind him. To advance meant going deeper into unknown enemy territory. He keyed his radio. "Colonel, I can't go back. They're behind me." There was a pause of 7 seconds, Anderson counted them, before Abrams responded. "Then find another option, Captain. Out." That was it. No instructions, no air support. The fog had grounded everything. No artillery. The German positions were too intermingled with American ones for safe fire missions. No reinforcements. The rest of Combat Command A was engaged on 3 other fronts simultaneously. C Company, 7 operational tanks, 31 men still functional. Surrounded on 3 sides, roadblocked, Radio contact with battalion tenuous at best. Ammunition at 60% after 12 minutes of continuous engagement. And northeast of them, in a farmhouse outside Moyenvik that had been converted to a command post, Major Werner Heilig was composing his report to Colonel Baca. Yet he reported that the American column had been hit, had taken casualties, and had gone off-road. His conclusion filed at 0630 hours. Enemy is disorganized. Collapse of resistance expected within the hour. He was looking at the same battle Anderson was fighting. He reached exactly the wrong conclusion, because he had never considered what happens when an American officer trained by Patton's system runs out of good options. He didn't know that Patton's doctrine specifically addressed this, that there was a name for what Anderson was about to do. A like on this video costs you nothing. For Dennis Ochoa, for Harold Biggs and his shredded arm, for every man in 7 tanks surrounded in a French field. It's the least we can do. You want to know what that name was? What Patton called it? Why it worked when nothing else would? And that's exactly what Part 3 is going to tell you. George S. Patton had a saying that his officers heard so many times they could recite it in their sleep. Never make a decision based on the enemy's capabilities. Make it based on the enemy's intentions. And then hit him somewhere he has not decided to be. This was not a slogan. It was a doctrine, formalized in Third Army training memoranda and distributed to every company-grade officer under Patton's command by August 1944. The specific document, Third Army Operational Memo No. 7, dated August 3, 1944, used language that Anderson had copied into his personal notebook. The fixed defense is an invitation. Accept it. But do not knock at the door they expect. Find the wall. What that meant in practice was this. When an enemy builds a defensive position, and they build it around an assumption of how you will attack, that assumption is their greatest vulnerability, because every man they position to cover the expected approach is a man who is not covering the unexpected one. Anderson knew this. In the farmland outside Aracourt, mud on his boots, smoke filling the air from 4 burning Shermans, he applied it. Here is what he saw when he looked at his situation without panic. The German attack had come from 3 directions: northeast, east, south. The west, the direction of Aracourt village itself, was where they assumed Anderson would try to retreat. They had left a screening force there, not a blocking force. A screening force exists to observe and report. A blocking force exists to stop movement. They had not blocked the west because they assumed a retreating, disorganized American column would be easy to pursue and destroy in the open. They had not committed their blocking force because they hadn't needed one yet. That gap, Anderson understood in the span of perhaps 90 seconds of mental calculation, was the wall. But there was a complication. Between his current position and the route west through the screening force lay the hamlet of Rechicourt-le-Petit. 8 stone farmhouses, a small church, a well, and at 0640 hours on September 19th, approximately 60 French civilians who had not evacuated. Old men, women, children. They had been there when the German attack began and had sheltered in cellars. Anderson's fastest route through the screening force ran directly through the hamlet's main street. He had 31 men and 7 tanks. Either his fastest route put 60 civilians in his line of fire, or more precisely, in the Germans' line of return fire the moment they saw where he was going. He could go around the hamlet, but around meant exposed ground, longer time, more opportunity for the German commander to redirect his blocking force and close the gap before Anderson reached it. Anderson called his surviving sergeants to his tank for 45 seconds. Not a conference, a decision. "We go around," he said. 200-meter detour, south of the hamlet. We don't go through people's homes. Sergeant Kowalski, radio still in hand from his disabled tank, voice coming through the headset. "That's an extra 4 minutes exposed." "I know." Germans might close the gap. I know. Okay, Kowalski said. You go south it is. This is the moment that the Army War College would later use when it incorporated the Battle of Aracourt into its curriculum as the defining example of what Patton's doctrine actually produced at the company level. Not recklessness, not cowboy improvisation, but the disciplined application of indirect thinking under pressure, combined with a moral compass that never confused the mission with the cost of the mission. The plan was simple and therefore dangerous in exactly the right way. Anderson's 7 tanks would move south of Rechicourt-le-Petit on a farm track his map marked as potentially passable. They would hit the German screening force from a direction it was not facing. They would move at maximum speed, suppress rather than destroy, and push through to the western edge of the German encirclement before the main panzer force could reorient. And they would do it in fog that was already beginning, slowly, too slowly, to thin. If this story has reached you, if Anderson's 45-second decision has told you something true about what leadership looks like when it costs something, this channel needs your subscription to keep building stories like it. Subscribe. It takes 3 seconds. It means these stories keep getting made. 7 tanks, 61 civilians safe in their cellars, a farm track that may or may not hold a tank's weight, and the fog burning off. This is where it gets bad before it gets resolved. 0652 hours. Anderson's column moved south, farm track, soft ground, and the lead tank, Corporal Trans, left ruts 18 inches deep with every yard it covered. The second tank followed in the same ruts and went deeper. By the time the third tank crossed the worst section, the track was a muddy canal. Still passable, barely. The fog was thinning from the east where the sun was fighting through. To the northeast, Anderson could hear the German main force. The sound of Panther engines has a specific pitch, higher and more regular than the Sherman's, and by now every surviving member of C Company could identify it by ear. The Germans had not yet understood what Anderson was doing. Their radio traffic, monitored by a signals unit attached to battalion headquarters, showed the 113th Panzer Brigade commander reporting to von Manteuffel at 0658 hours that the American column was, quote, attempting to reform under cover of the village area, meaning they thought Anderson had retreated into Rechicourt-le-Petit. He had gone around it, and they didn't know. 4 minutes, that was the gift. The German screening force, 2 half-tracks and a single Panzer IV positioned on the western road, was watching the road. Not the farm track, not the muddy southern approach, the road. Trans tank came out of the farm track at 0701 hours and put its first round through the lead half-track at a range of 220 meters. Before the German crew had completed their turn toward the sound of his engine, Anderson was already transmitting, "Go! Go! Go!" What followed was 11 minutes that Corporal Tran later described in a letter to his mother, written from a field hospital in Nancy, dated September 30th, 1944. "Mom, I don't know how to write what that 11 minutes was like. You aim and fire and aim and fire, and there's no time to think about what you're hitting. You just acquire and trigger, and the whole time you're thinking, don't stop moving. If you stop moving, you're dead. And the captain's voice is on the radio saying, push, 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 and you push." The German screening force had 3 vehicles and 14 men. After 90 seconds of contact, it had 1 vehicle, the Panzer IV, which backed off the road and into a tree line, and 7 men, several of whom were already withdrawing on foot. Anderson didn't pursue. He didn't have the ammunition or the men to clear a tree line. He pushed west. 706 hours. 6 of Anderson's 7 tanks were through the gap. The 7th, commanded by Sergeant Willis Grant, 28 from Birmingham, in Alabama, through a track on the farm road, 40 meters short of the western edge. Grant's crew had 60 seconds, maybe 90, before the German main force understood the gap and closed it. Anderson made the call. "Grant, disable your gun and get your crew moving, now." Grant later in his after-action statement, "The captain didn't leave us. Let me be clear about that. He left the tank because the tank was already lost. He sent his command vehicle back 30 meters to pick up my crew and fit 5 extra men into a tank that seats 4. We were on top of each other like sardines. I was half out the loader's hatch. But we moved. 6 tanks, 31 men crammed into them. Moving west. Behind them, the gap was closing. At 0709 hours, the German 113th Panzer Brigade's operational log records. American column not in village area. I position unknown. Searching. They were searching in the wrong direction for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It doesn't sound like much. It was everything. Anderson reached the main Aracourt Road at 0713 hours. He now had a problem that was better than the problem he'd had 20 minutes ago, but was still very much a problem. He was west of the German encirclement with 6 tanks, 31 men, ammunition at 38%, 1 seriously wounded crew member, Private Biggs, whose arm had stopped bleeding only because his field dressing had dried to the wound, and a German armored force that now numbered, per the radio traffic battalion had been monitoring. Over 40 vehicles actively maneuvering in his operational area. He was not out. He was differently surrounded. He called Colonel Abrams at 0715. "Colonel, I'm west of the junction. I have 6 tanks. I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you because I'm only going to say it once and then I'm going to go do it whether you approve or not." There is no documented record of Abrams's response to this specific statement. What is documented is that Abrams immediately requested artillery support from Corps, which was granted though the first rounds wouldn't arrive for 11 minutes, and then transmitted a single word back to Anderson. Understood. Anderson's plan conceived in approximately the time it took you to read the last 3 paragraphs, used the single asset the Germans had not accounted for. They knew his position only approximately. Their main force was oriented east to west, expecting an American retreat. If he moved north, back toward the original objective, in the road junction, and moved fast, he would be attacking from a direction the German formation's rear was exposed to. He was going back to the junction, the place he'd been ordered to take 8 hours ago. The place he'd been retreating from for the last 40 minutes. The Germans had a word for this. They used it later in prisoner interrogations and in the post-battle reports that German headquarters compiled in October 1944. The word was unberechenbar, unpredictable. But that's not quite what they meant. What they meant was, we could not model this because we did not believe an American officer in this situation would attack. At 0718 hours, Anderson's 6 tanks turned north. At 0719 hours, the German 113th Brigade's operational log records, contact lost with screening force west of junction, requesting infantry sweep. At 0724 hours, a Corporal Tron's gun, still working, still accurate, crew still functional, fired the round that destroyed the command half-track of Major Werner Heilig, who had filed the 0630 report predicting American collapse within the hour. Heilig survived. He would be captured 17 days later. The artillery arrived at 0726 hours, Corps guns firing on coordinates Anderson had transmitted before his radio partially failed. The shells hit the German column at its thickest point, where the main panzer force had massed expecting to pursue the retreating Americans. 31 German vehicles were struck. 14 were destroyed or immobilized in the initial barrage. The German formation broke, not routed. These were professionals and they withdrew in tactical sequence, but broke in the sense that the attack collapsed. And they pulled back 2 kilometers northeast, ceding the junction. Ceding the ground they had committed 400 armored vehicles to take. Anderson reached the road junction at 0741 hours. He stopped his tank, got out, stood in the mud at the junction of the roads to Moyenvik and Chateau Salin and looked at what they had done. Private Harold Biggs was unconscious but breathing in the tank behind him. Sergeant Willis Grant was on top of the tank he'd had to abandon his own for, watching the German withdrawal through binoculars. Corporal Tran was reloading, methodically, quietly, as if this were still a firing range in the United States. Sergeant Kowalski, still in his disabled tank 2 kilometers east, came over the radio. His voice was very calm. "Captain, you at the junction?" "We're at the junction, Ray." A pause. "It's good," Kowalski said. "Good." Anderson sat down on the hull of his tank and did not move for 6 minutes. The battlefield at Aricourt on the morning of September 20th, 1944 did not look like victory. It looked like a wrecker's yard spread across French farmland. Burned out hulls, tracks thrown in the mud, already rusting in the September damp. Supply crates ripped open by blast, their contents, rations, medical supplies, ammunition, scattered across 100 meters of open ground. The smell of burned fuel and something worse, something that any veteran knows and civilians cannot fully imagine, that settled over the plateau like weather. C Company had lost 6 tanks and 11 men in the engagement. Dennis Ochoa was dead. Corporal Michael Ferris, 24, from Akron, Ohio, dead. 3 others killed in the initial ambush. 6 wounded. 2 of them seriously enough to require evacuation. Private Harold Biggs lost the use of 2 fingers on his right hand. He relearned to shoot left-handed and returned to duty 6 weeks later. Now here is the enemy's verdict. The Battle of Aricourt. The full engagement, not just C Company's action, but the entire 12-day confrontation between the 4th Armored Division and the German 5th Panzer Army, ended on September 29, 1944. The numbers are not complicated. The Americans destroyed 281 German armored vehicles. They lost approximately 50 of their own. Against a force that outgunned them at every range above 500 meters, that had more vehicles, more experienced crews, and the advantage of choosing when and where to attack. Yet the 4th Armored Division had not merely held, it had inflicted a ratio of destruction that shook German armored doctrine to its foundations. General Hasso von Manteuffel, in his post-war memoir Mit den Panzern in Ost und West, published in 1966, wrote this about the engagement. He described the American tankers as having displayed a quality he called Gefechtsflexibilität, tactical elasticity, that his own training system specifically did not produce. He wrote that the Americans seemed to have no fear of losing ground because they never attached to ground the way German defensive doctrine demanded. They treated terrain as information, not as territory. Yet he wrote, and this is the line that military historians have returned to repeatedly, that to fight an army that reads obstacles as opportunities is to fight an army that cannot be cornered because it does not recognize corners. Major Werner Heilig, interviewed by Allied intelligence officers on October 16, 1944, after his capture, was asked what he remembered about the morning of September 19th. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, through an interpreter in precise German, that what he remembered most was not the artillery, not the tank fire, not the moment his command vehicle was destroyed. What he remembered was looking at his map at 07:15 hours and realizing the Americans were somewhere his map said they could not possibly be. We had designed a cage, he said. See you, they simply didn't know they were in it. Captain Leroy Anderson received the Silver Star for his actions on September 19th. The citation noted his initiative, tactical acumen, and disregard for personal safety in terms that were accurate but insufficient. He stood in a field hospital in Nancy on September 21st when they pinned it on him. He said in the only public statement he ever made about the battle, "Patton always said, if you're going the wrong way, speed up." What he meant was commitment is the only substitute for a perfect plan. We didn't have a perfect plan. We had speed and commitment and men I trusted. Patton received the combat report for the full Battle of Aracourt on September 22nd. He wrote one line in his diary that evening. "The 4th Armored has done it again. They are perhaps the finest soldiers in the world, and the Germans thought they had them. The Germans are wrong about Americans with a consistency that begins to look like a character flaw." He was not wrong about that either. Leroy Anderson went home to Duluth in the spring of 1945. Carol Ann was 5 years old. She was wearing the same style of winter coat, impractically large as if her mother was buying ahead, when he came through the door. He picked her up and held her and did not put her down for a long time. He never wrote a memoir. He returned to civil engineering. He designed road intersections and highway bridges for the Minnesota Department of Transportation for 22 years. His colleagues said he had an unusual talent for finding the indirect route, the solution that looked wrong on the initial plan but proved correct under the pressure of implementation. He died in 1987. He is buried in Duluth. The road junction at Aracourt still exists. If you pull up the satellite view today, the junction of the D955 and D914 east of the village, you are looking at ground that was held by 6 American tanks and 31 men on the morning of September 19, 1944, against everything the Wehrmacht's armored doctrine could bring to bear. It doesn't look like much, just roads meeting in a French field. That's usually how it is with the places where something real happened. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in Patton's 3rd Army, the 4th Armored, the 37th Tank Battalion, any unit that rolled across France in the autumn of 1944, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What campaign? Where did they end up? Those stories live in family memory and nowhere else, and don't let them stay there. The lesson of Aracourt is not that Americans are invincible. It is that a doctrine built on flexibility defeats a doctrine built on certainty. Every time, in every era, on every kind of battlefield. An obstacle is data. A problem is information. A cage only works if the man inside believes he's caged. Anderson didn't believe it, and that made all the difference.